process of going live, you're actually live.
It says we're live, you're right. It just happened.
Like, so there's lots of times when we do this Facebook Live on our Native Studies Colloquium, which we want to have you, by the way, Tanya, so hopefully in the winter, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Anyways, so, and then there's lots of times where I'm just like, you know, talking about whatever, my day or whatever, and it like makes it onto the beginning of the video. So
well, that's what's happening like right now, just so you know. Yeah, that's exactly what's happening. So welcome everybody to our September Free Press Book Club meeting. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Erin Labar. I am your Free Press Book Club admin and the manager of audience engagement for news at the paper. I'm just going to do a quick introduction because we have a bunch of new faces with us this month. Of course, we have our author, Tanya Talaga. Thank you so much for being here. We have Winnipeg Free Press columnist Nigan Sinclair. And then we have Leah Wilson from the Institute for International Women's Rights, Manitoba, who is our collaborator for this month's book club. And she's going to come on a little bit later and tell you more about an event that they are hosting with Tanya tomorrow. Before we get into the actual book club portion of the evening, you'll notice that we are all wearing our orange shirts. And I was going to ask Nigan to explain a little bit about what Orange Shirt Day is today, September 30th.
Okay, well, this is a special Orange Shirt Day because it's pandemic version 2020. And what I tell everybody is this is a beautiful mask that was provided by Unifor, who is also supportive at the Winnipeg Free Press, and we're involved with the Winnipeg Free Press. And they've distributed approximately 10,000 of these nationally. And so check it out, wonderful work that they're being done. And you may have noticed, you know, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people today wearing orange shirts. Today is a day in which we commemorate and we recognize, we honor the contributions of residential school survivors. They often like to call themselves thrivers, and the intergenerational legacies that have been produced from residential schools. And wearing an orange shirt is how I describe it, is a commitment. It's a commitment to ensure that the schools, nothing like the schools is ever seen again, and that those legacies coming from the schools, which is this draconian system of control of Indigenous peoples, many false beliefs and stereotypes surrounding Indigenous peoples, and an ongoing situation of poverty that Indigenous peoples are experiencing, and that non-Indigenous peoples have profited mightily from all three of those, that we change that we commit to an experience in which we live something closer to treaty, which is a reciprocal, mutually beneficial relationship. And so today when we wear orange shirts, we're thinking about those thrivers, but we're also thinking about our role and responsibility of moving forward into the future to create a better situation than what we have inherited for our children.
Thank you so much for that. And I'm just super grateful that we're able to gather today as a community to have this discussion specifically today. So thank you all so much for being here for that. Other housekeeping is normal stuff. If you want to ask a question, you can pop it in the chat box to the right of your video. And I'm going to throw it over to Leah to do an introduction of the book. And I'm going to pop off and I'll be back a little bit later. So Leah, that's over to you.
Thanks, Erin. So I'm so pleased and honored to introduce our best-selling and award-winning author for the night, Tanya Talaga. We'll be discussing her most recent publication, All Our Relations, Finding the Path Forward, which examines and explores the alarmingly high rate of youth suicide in Indigenous communities in both Canada and beyond. From Northern Ontario to Nunavut, Norway, Brazil, Australia, and the United States, the Indigenous experience in colonized nations is startlingly similar and deeply disturbing. It is an experience marked by the violent separation of peoples from the land, the separation of families, and the separation of individuals from the traditional ways of life, all of which have culminated in a spiritual separation that has had an enduring impact on generations of Indigenous children and community. As a result of the colonial legacy, too many generations of communities today lack the access to basic determinants of health, income, employment, education, a safe environment, health services, and more, that are leading to a national mental health and youth suicide crisis that expands to the global scale. But Talaga reminds us, First Peoples also share a history of resiliency and civil rights activism. From the occupation of Alcatraz, led by the Indians of all tribes, to the Northern Ontario Sterling Lake Quiet Riot, to the Standing Rock protests against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which united Indigenous nations from across Turtle Island in solidarity. Based on her work during the Atkinson Fellowship, All Our Relations is a powerful call for action, justice, and for a better, more equitable world for all Indigenous peoples. Talaga is the author of Seven Fallen Feathers as well, the winner of the RBC Taylor Prize and the Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing, among many other awards. Talaga worked for more than 20 years as a journalist for the Toronto Star and is now a columnist with an investigative reporter with the Globe and Mail. So please join me in welcoming Tanya. I shall be reading an excerpt from All Our Relations.
Buzu Anin Wachea, Tanya Talaga Nagisnikas. I'm so grateful to be here today, and I'm talking to you from my home. I live in Tekaronto on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the traditional home of the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat people. I just want to say that how grateful I am for the Winnipeg Free Press hosting me, and how grateful I am for Nigun to be here today to discuss All Our Relations on Orange Shirt Day. It's particularly poignant that we're gathered here today to talk about All Our Relations, because this is a really important day. You know, it's a day of memory, it's a day of resilience, it's a day of power for Indigenous people. And before I begin the excerpt too, I just want to have a small nod to Nigun's father, who I'm thinking about tonight, Senator Murray Sinclair, who was a very, very big help to me as I put together this book. And keeping in mind with what day it is today, and that we all have our own shirts, I actually thought I would do a small reading about one of the last schools to close, residential schools to close in Canada. And this reading that I'm going to do today is about the Quiet Riot at Sterling Lake Indian Residential School in Northwestern Ontario. It was a Mennonite-run school. I'll just read it to you now, and we'll stop talking. I'll talk to you more about it once I'm done. This is from the last chapter of the book. Chapter 5, and the chapter title is "We Are Not Going Anywhere." They called it the Quiet Riot. Back in March 1987, Rance Christensen from Kingfisher Lake First Nation was a 17-year-old grade 11 student at Sterling Lake, a Mennonite-run Indian residential school in Northern Ontario. While most residential schools closed in the 1960s and 1970s, the Mennonite Church began to establish its own residential schools in the north, starting in the late 1950s. Sterling Lake, also known as Waboon Bay Academy, opened its doors in 1971, 273 kilometers north of Sioux Lookout, in the deep, dense boreal forest. The school, made up of old buildings delivered by flatbed truck from a mine called Pickle Crow, had become coeducational after the school for girls, Crystal Lake, closed in 1986. Rance remembers how strict the instructors were at Sterling, and how the school felt more like a prison than the one he had attended in Winnipeg for grades 9 and 10. The students were not allowed to listen to rock music, which the teachers called the devil's music. Cassette tapes of bands like Motley Crue and the Rolling Stones were confiscated. The students could only listen to Mennonite hymns. Their mail was censored, so they couldn't tell their parents what was happening inside those school walls. Quote, "We couldn't write a bad thing about what we were experiencing, and if we did, something they didn't like, they would give us demerit points. Sometimes we'd have to go out in the winter and we would saw hundreds of logs with a handsaw," he recalls. The winters north of Sioux Lookout can dip to temperatures around -40. They want us to be robots, under control. You do this or you do that, not realizing that when you're out there and isolated and held down by rigid rules, you want your freedom. The boys lived in dorms, separate from the girls. By 10:30 p.m. it was lights out. The students had to be at breakfast sharp, 7 a.m. every morning, and if they were late, they had to do chores. The food, Rance remembers, was really crappy, and only on Sundays were there home-cooked meals. For breakfast, they were always served greasy oats with goat's milk. Saturday mornings were special. They had cornflakes. The teachers used corporal punishment to keep the students in line. Normally, such disciplinary action came out of nowhere. Suddenly, a pupil was picked out of class or a hallway and they were brutally bullied and made an example of. Rance remembers what they did to him as if it were yesterday. They called us, one by one, to a certain dormitory and they took us downstairs. There were 4 adult men waiting down there. 2 of them held my arms and legs, and one put his whole body weight on me while the other strapped me with a paddle, really, really hard. He caused a lot of bruising. By the time he was done, I was in agony. It was torture. When they were finished, they got the scissors out and they cut his hair. He felt violated all over again. In my case, they didn't just strap me to humiliate me further. They cut off my hair. Rance never received any medical treatment. For a week, his behind was black, bruised all over. He could walk, but sitting down was excruciating. And when the bruising began to heal, it itched something awful. They did it to all of us. They took great enjoyment out of it. It was sadistic. It was far away from their religious upbringing, he says. For all the good things you hear about Mennonites, this was not the case with these guys. I don't know. It was like prison or something. They ran a prison school. After his beating, Rance and the other older students began to talk. They had to do something. They eventually decided that if the teachers tried to hit another student, they were going to resist. Then one evening, when some of the male students met some of the females past curfew, the teachers struck. They caught one of the teen boys. Another ran off to tell Rance. And I'm going to leave it there. You're going to have to read the book to know the rest. But why I read that was because this is one of the only examples that I found of a residential school where there was a resistance, where the students fought back. And what, to me, this is a really quite a personal account too, because I had friends that attended Sterling Lake, and you know, these friends are my age as well. And I think I was going to school in Toronto at the same time that they were there fighting for their lives and having an absolutely different experience than I was. So I think of them today.
Great. Well, miigwech for that. I was actually wondering when you, as soon as you picked that passage, my immediate thought was, "Ooh, how are people going to handle that?" Because the story that you tell at the end is a pretty remarkable story about resistance and about fighting back. And and I think while I have heard many stories of students fighting back, not in terms of like a collective fight back. It's often one student, it's often one or two brothers usually, or sometimes people who are in a situation where they're protecting another student who is being abused. There's a lot more stories involving, I've heard of students fighting against other students. And so the untold stories of residential school is oftentimes the abuse that students perpetuated onto other students, what they learned from having been abused themselves. And so these are some pretty important stories, but I think probably what our readers at the Winnipeg Free Press may be the most impacted by that passage is the fact that you're talking about Mennonites. And in Manitoba, of course, the Mennonite community is a very close community. It's a community that's contributed an incredible amount to Manitoba's economy. Much of the southern parts of Manitoba were settled by people of Mennonite background, of Mennonite communities. And it's sometimes discomforting for those in the Mennonite community to talk about that history, because what it talks about, Mennonite people are very proud, and they're very particularly proud about their contributions to communities, also the ways in which they came here with virtually nothing and built up a community. And I think what's often forgotten, and in talks at the Canadian Mennonite University, I've worked there for a few years and taught classes there, is the discomfort involving they were on stolen land. They were inheriting many of the legacies of Canadians' Indian policy, which removed people off the land so that Mennonites could be there. And then in the case of residential schools, they profited they profited off the indoctrination and genocide of Indigenous peoples. And I think many in the Mennonite community are very discomforted by that. And so I just want to acknowledge that that can be an uncomfortable truth for many of our readers, but it's also one that really needs to be told. And maybe what we could talk about at the first beginning, we have a number of reader questions that we'd like to ask you. And I know that I've got a lot of questions as well too, and Leah, no doubt. And so we'll try to sort of fire them at you if that's okay. And then, you know, you can go with wherever direction you'd like to go. And if you would like to direct people to pages in the book or areas of the book that you're going to refer to, that would be great. Like, for example, this is a question from Shirley Canty, who's one of our readers. And she says, what got you interested in the subject of suicide, and particular suicide within the Indigenous community? And what I'm going to ask you to do is just speak very briefly about your opening chapter involving Thunder Bay, because many of us in Winnipeg here have deep ties to Thunder Bay. I'm there all the time doing workshops and delivering you know, messages, working with Lakehead District School Board, also Lakehead University. So I have very deep ties and connections with Thunder Bay, and many Thunder Bay people come here, especially young people. So if you could talk about the situation of suicide, why suicide? Did you pick this as an ongoing theme for your Massey lectures, which turned into this book? And then also maybe touch upon Thunder Bay just a little bit.
Okay, I promise to try and do that all rather quickly, but
yeah, I like to set up unfair questions.
Wow, I know. Well, first off, I'll start by saying that actually, my dad was from Winnipeg. My dad was Polish Canadian, and he grew up in Winnipeg on Lipton Avenue, actually. So for people that are oh my gosh, that are watching and listening to this, and my mom is from the traditional territory of Fort William First Nation. And so they met, they married, had me. And, you know, when you talk about ties to Thunder Bay, I as well clearly do. That's where my mother's family is from. That's where all of my mother's relations are from, oh my gosh, from time immemorial. And so this is quite a special area to me, and I'm there often. I'm there often. In fact, I just got back on Sunday night from Thunder Bay. And why I started to do a book on youth suicide actually had to do with the fact that I had been reporting as a reporter for the Toronto Star on suicide, and it was clearly something that I saw in our communities about youth dying. And when I saw it covered in newspapers, it was always about numbers, you know. It only made the news if there was like a rash of suicide attempts or suicides in Attawapiskat or in other communities. And I think it was around in 2010, I traveled up to the James Bay coast, and I was in Moose Factory and visiting with Nellie Trapper. And Nellie Trapper, she was one of the youth workers at Peakatano, which is a Children's Aid Society, First Nations run Children's Aid Society up there. And I remember being with her and talking about this. And I specifically went there as a reporter to do a story on why it is our kids are dying. And I'll never forget that interview with Nellie and sitting there and speaking with her for a while. And she every day was on the phone. She was on the hotline, the youth suicide hotline for all the kids. And Nellie had experienced her own loss. She went home one day to find her son hanging in his closet. The story of Nellie, of what she has been through and how she keeps going and still extending her arms and her hands out to our youth, really inspired me. And, you know, every time as a newspaper reporter, I would see people write stories or editors sort of shrug off stories of our youth and the numbers that were coming in. People were looking at every number represented a person, and every suicide is preventable. And I knew that I couldn't tell the story, just like with Seven Fallen Feathers, of how it is our children are dying at their own hands, because it is such a bigger story. It's a story of colonization. It's a story of genocide. It's a story of our children that don't have access to clean water. They don't have access oftentimes to parents who love them, or someone who tucks them in at night and tells them that they belong. All of these things contribute to suicide. And then when I started looking around the world in other indigenized nations, I kept seeing the same pattern over and over and over again. Make a long story short, that's why I wanted to do this book in particular. And I knew it was going to be something a lot more than just what doctors say about suicide or what the medical professionals say, because I think that Western medicine's been looking in the wrong spot when they're looking for answers.
Yeah, I can't echo that more in terms of the issues involving poverty and what oftentimes, as you point out in the book, I love that part where you start off by saying the thing about suicide is it's preventable. And it's not only preventable, but it's every single death, there's a chance. Unlike, a car accident, for example, or, other ways that people pass away. But, the critical thing that you're pointing out there that I think is important to identify, and just to bring it home in Winnipeg for just a moment, the situation involving mental health is a crisis for Indigenous communities. And we particularly saw it during the pandemic here. Overdoses have gone up. The needle use has gone up 12% on the streets. There's more and more needing supports for people in domestic abuse situations, particularly children in the child welfare system who are going through atrophy and feelings they can't connect with their parents who are often far away. This pandemic has exponentially created the situation of mental challenges, stress, anxiety. And what you're pointing out in Thunder Bay is it was already terrible to begin with, and now you add the pandemic on top of that. Mental health is the challenge. It's not oftentimes this, poverty is big and important, but mental health is such an important challenge within our young people and all Indigenous people, really, because of the trauma, right? Leah, go ahead. Question 2 there, or another question from one of our readers?
Sure. So a question here is regarding what society can do, but I want to provide a bit of context because we just recently saw the death of Joy Sequin from the Atakwa Nation in Quebec. And for those who may not know, her death occurred in hospital, and she had recorded some of the very degrading and horrific things that nurses had said. And I think it just speaks to the violence that we see perpetuated within our systems, and violence that you reiterate in many ways is encountered within all our relations. And so for people who see this video or hear this story and they feel enraged of this violence, I'm just wondering if you can put forward, what can people do and ways that they can get engaged? Because as one of our readers said, they wrote in, they feel so compelled and they're struck into what they can do as a reader, but then also as someone who's a settler within Canada. So I'm wondering if you can respond to that.
It's always a hard question, isn't it? When people, and again, I'm sure you get asked this all the time too, what can I do? I find it's a real individualistic response, right? Every person can do something on their own. And, there are many answers to that. One broad answer that I always give is actually to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the calls to action. There's over 80 calls to action. And, Nagan's dad often says, if every person was to take one of those calls and adopt them to their own life, that helps to make a difference. It's really tough. I found yesterday a really tough day. Yesterday, not only did we hear the news about, one of our sisters in Quebec trying to access the healthcare system, but also too, Angela Starrett put out and the UC-BC, the chiefs from BC, they also put out a note about a youth who died in care. And he had been there, and he had passed away 4 days before anyone had found him. And then that happens, and then there's the US presidential debate. When I'm staring at these sort of two old white guys, debating the fate of Turtle Island, and I was rather despondent. I'm not gonna lie. I think Jesse Wente put out
Yeah, the way you put it there is so accurate and mind-blowing, but it is the face of colonialism. I mean, it's the face of
100%. It was just
amazing.
like, it was like yesterday, it was just like, can this really be happening? Of course this is really happening. And again, I was reminded of the two different worlds we walk in, you know, like it's, sometimes I often feel that way. You know, I just got back from Thunder Bay. I was spending time on the land, and I was with the Nan Youth Council, you know, and Grand Chief Alvin Fiddler from Anishinaabe Nation. And, you know, I was sitting here watching him field all these phone calls, trying to figure out what was going on with his communities, and with COVID, the COVID response, and trying to honestly come up with a public health plan out of thin air, because many of the communities in the north do not have doctors or nurses or clean running water. So trying to get together a COVID response so quickly, you know, and actually very much is the subject of this book, the failures of Canada's healthcare system. So anyways, I just feel sometimes that we were just from two different worlds, you know, and then I'm watching the presidential debate last night, or I tried to, and I just get despondent over that. And so I think maybe a lot of people are feeling that way. And so to get right back to your question, I always do get to a point. I do talk in circles. I should warn you all about that. But, you know, getting back to it, you can do something. You can vote. You can actually, you know, that's sort of the bigger issue, but you can get behind Indigenous candidates. You can support parties or people that are trying to change things, and not just pay lip service. There are things you can do. Education is, of course, one of the biggest ones. Education reform, and making sure our children hear the true history of this country.
Yeah, I remember even reading back in Seven Fallen Feathers, and like you said earlier, just seeing like the interconnectedness of systems like healthcare, but then how that impacts education and politics, and recognizing how a lot of like the systems are intertwined and connected, and being able to see that connectedness. And then I think once you see that, you do see ways that you can act and take that responsibility within those different like points in your life too.
For sure.
So we have another reader question here, but I'm going to add a preface to it, only because I kind of disagree with the fundamental aspect of the question, but I'm still going to ask the question. So what this question has to do with, you know, the argument that, or the idea, and I can understand how somebody would feel this way, that the book is a very sad book, and it's a book that it talks about a lot of tragedy. And undoubtedly, there are elements. I mean, residential schools is only one part, the suicides in Thunder Bay is another part. And then you kind of take that globally. You talk about Australia, you talk about Finland, you know, and so I absolutely understand how this book could be construed as a kind of a documentation of tragedy globally. What I would say is it's also a reminder that colonialism operates so similarly globally. But the thing that I think that I noticed the most, and why I don't see this as a sad book, is that all of my friends are in here. and like one of the most amazing things about I Don't Know More that was a real eye-opener for me is that during that time period, I met yourself, I met many other people. One of my best friends is Pam Palmater, and Pam and I talk every day. And, you know, people, certain media agencies like to characterize Pam as this angry revolutionary, but there's nothing farther from the truth. She's one of the most peaceful, kindest, and I would even dare to say nerdiest people that I know. Love science fiction, for example, and you know, is a person who is just everyday, but she also is a fierce advocate for her nation and for her people, and so she's not going to tolerate violence. And she's going to speak up for that, and like yourself. And, you know, there are two people in this book that, you know, I have deep admiration for. I know Nate Obed and Cindy Blackstock. And Cindy actually wrote a letter supporting my father to go into the Senate. So she became a great family person. So she's now kind of a cousin of ours in our family. We very close to our family. But the point of me saying this is that just like you're talking about in that chapter that you read of students coming together to perform collective resistance, that is really the undercurrent of the story of the book, is you connecting and talking. I think of this book as like sort of thinking like a web. Like here you are, but you've got all this connection here and here and here, and all of these amazing leaders, often, you know, people who characterize chiefs as corrupt. And so just, there is nothing farther than the truth, dedicated to their nation, working 24 hours a day. You know, no other MP has to work like a chief has to work, frankly. Nobody goes to a MP's house at 3 a.m. for frozen pipes. Chiefs have to do that all the time. And as you point out, I mean, this is really a collective resistance of many people working at the same time. And can you speak a little bit about how people might see the book as tragic and sad? And so I certainly understand why that might be the case. But how do you feel? How do you feel about the impression that the book often leaves on perhaps people who are coming to this issue for the first time as tragic?
Miigwech, for that question. That's a good question. No one's ever asked me that before. I think that it's important to set the record straight, and I think it's important to document our history. And there's so much going on right now, and we're surrounded by people with so much knowledge. You know, you mentioned Cindy, your father, Nitan Obed, Alvin Fiddler, Salma Makwa. I mean, so many people that we know and have lived these life experiences, our life experiences, the life experiences of our families. You know, there's a story of resilience in that. I think there's a story in getting Canada and the world to pay attention to what has happened, and to pay attention to the genocide in this country, in America, in Brazil, the ongoing genocide, you know, the ongoing genocide of the Sami people in Australia. I mean, it's just the same thing over and over and over again. But we are all bound together by this incredible fact that we are still here. We are thriving, you know, in the face of, you know, our women are still being murdered and they're still going missing. You know, we are still experiencing huge issues with our rights, equity issues. We still have so long to go, like so far to go, and so much to do. But it's really quite incredible to me. We keep going. Of course we do, because we are so resilient. And that's what I meant to show in this book, you know, that yes, this is a history, and yes, this is what was said about us. And I think we need to record that too, because there aren't a lot of books that'll tell you the history of our people. You know, there aren't a lot of books. There are lots of books that don't have any history of what happened in the past. And we have a lot more books coming up now, for sure. But we have to write this down. You know, we have to share the knowledge that we have. And I really do hope that people see this as a call to action, because it really truly is, the whole book. And the fact that, especially at the end of the book, you know, we are still here and we're still going. And look at how many artists there are, writers, professors, speakers. We contribute, and we are so strong. And if Canada would only open its eyes and see that, this country could be so much better than it is now. And that's actually my hope. And that's what I really hoped to get across in this book.
Yeah, I do think that resiliency comes across throughout the whole book, and you really see it across generations too within the book, of youth leaders who are there, and then the elders who contribute as well. And that's something I found came out throughout the book. And kind of this next question is a bit of a bridge as well, contributed by one of our readers, but specifically it's regarding kind of like the across an international theme of colonization, like Nigan had referred to. But in the later chapter in the book on 163, you refer to the incident of David Dungey Jr., which is similarly and eerily similar to the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And so we had a reader wondering, how did you react to the news of the Floyd killing? And I'm wondering if you can just speak to that in terms of like resistance work across borders, because as you later write in the latter half of the book also, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, which I think is a very apt and applicable quote from Martin Luther King Jr. So if you could address those in any way.
Thanks for bringing that up, actually. And Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about David Dungey Jr. He was 26 years old, and he was an Aboriginal man who had mental health issues, and he was diabetic, and he was tackled by prison guards in a Sydney jail. And it was very similar to George Floyd. He was caught on video, of course, because video captured everything, saying, "I can't breathe, I can't breathe." And he eventually died. I mean, how many times have we heard this uttered? You know, if it's not by Indigenous people, it's by Black Americans, Black Canadians. It's everywhere, you know. And when I heard what happened to George Floyd, I immediately thought of David Dungey. And again, the ties that bind us, right? There are so many similarities in the lived experience between Black Canadians, Black Americans, and Indigenous people on Turtle Island. Um, and it's true, Martin Luther King wrote about it, just not a lot, but he did write about it. And he talked about, which always struck me when I read this quote from him, or this passage from him, about America being a country that was formed on violence. And that is so true. The whole Turtle Island was absolutely founded on violence, you know. You just look at the policies of Andrew Jackson, look at the extermination policies of the US government. General Tecumseh Sherman, what was his quote? "I've made hundreds of treaties with Indians and I haven't respected a single one of them." You know, and it's remarkable. That violence, that extermination of our people led way to slavery. And we have a country that is an entire, you know, continent built on violence, and we're still seeing it. We're still seeing it. And are we surprised by that? No, no, really, because of genocide that is still ongoing. Don't know if that answers the question, but
I was waiting for Leah to jump in. There's actually a second part from a reader. Do you want to do that part, Leah, or do you want me to do that, or?
You can go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now, so Anton, one of our readers, Anton, is asking about the on page 101, and we're going to sort of deep dive into theory a little bit here, and because I mean, this is something that we often talk about in cultural studies, native studies, as what's often referred to as a third space. And you talked before about living in two worlds. I think that, I mean, oftentimes it's that the idea of a third space is attributed to a theorist called Homi Bhabha, who articulated the idea that people within racialized communities in relation to mainstream communities, often white communities, live in this interactive space, or, you know, more to bring it more to Indigenous peoples, Lewis Owens would call that the frontier space, the space in which people are in between, or where collaboration, often misunderstandings take place, but there's a whole bunch of power. Now, you refer to it in page 100 and 102. And so Anton's asking if you could just describe quickly about what the third space means when Helen is using it. And then, is that the place where suicide emerges for young people?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. And again, thanks for your insight into that as well. You know, I've never really thought of it that way, but that's so true, isn't it? That space in between. And we do very much function in that space in between. And that shows you that I'm not an academic, right? And so I'm always fascinated when I find out these theories. Helen, I was very grateful to meet her. Dr. Helen Milroy is, well, she was the very first female psychiatrist, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychiatrist in Australia. And I had the really incredible chance to meet her and spend time with her in the Sami lands, actually, and then in Sweden later on at a conference. We went on this trip to go visit the Sami in the north and in Norway, actually, and then we all went to Stockholm. That's another story, though. But I met Helen, and she talked a lot to me about the third space, and it is the space in between, because it's important for all of us to know, like we know as First Nations people, we know that children don't ask for the circumstances that they are born in. And oftentimes, you know, our children are born into circumstances without the social determinants of health, without the things that grow healthy children in modern day society, right? So without safe housing, safe communities, nutritious food in the fridge, without access to clean water, without access to healthcare, a doctor or a nurse. I could show you many communities in Northern Ontario, and I know Northern Manitoba is the same, where there are no doctors, there are no nurses, you know, there are no traffic lights, there are no stores. We've got a Northern store and that's it. You don't have an access to a high school. Imagine that in this country that talks about the greatness of, you know, of the education system, just like the healthcare system. No doctors, no high school. How can this be? So you have these children born, you know, into circumstances, and they could be born into families too that are struggling due to intergenerational trauma, due to the violence of colonization, due to the fact that they've been taken away from their houses, from their parents, their communities, their language, from everything. And they have no tethers. You know, as First Nations people, your ceremonies are your tethers. You know, your community is your tethers. Your land, the land teaches you language. The land teaches you who you are, because we've always been on the land. And if you're an Anishinaabe person, you believe that you are joined to the land. You are joined to the trees, the land, the water is part of you, and everyone is part of a continuum. Everyone born has a purpose in life. If you don't know about who you are, if you don't have that sense of belonging, if you have no one to be that person in your life who loves you and tells you all about this, you're floating in that third space. You don't know who you are, what your purpose in life is, and where you belong.
When you were talking there, I was seeing Midewin, you know, like I mean, I don't know if you've been to many Midewin ceremonies, but I was raised Midewin from a very young age. And that ceremony, of that initiation ceremony, is where we literally tie, or we remind ourselves that we are tied to the earth. So we physically tie ourselves to the earth. And what we do is we have the tree of life that we are all connected to. And that's what that ceremony is about. It's about establishing that permanent connection with the earth itself. And so, yeah, that's what I was seeing Midewin. I was seeing the lodge. I was seeing initiation ceremonies, particularly for young children, but also for, you know, elders and, you know, people of all ages. Myself, my own initiation. So I was seeing that as you were describing. It's a really beautiful vision. So I'm not sure if Leah has anything more before Aaron takes it over to wrap it up. So go ahead, Leah, if you want to say anything more or add anything more.
No, I'm just so appreciative of being able to learn from you, Tanya, and I learned from you throughout university, and I continue to learn from all the lessons that you share, and I'm so grateful to be able to have these resources and share them with other people. So I'm eternally grateful.
I've written many times about this in my column, but when Anishinaabe meet together, we say the word miigwech, which doesn't mean thank you. It means I will give. So it comes from the verb I give. So miigwech to Tanya, my cousin, my Anishinaabe cousin, who we're so distant, but I still feel like through social media we're connected much closer than we really are.
I do too.
And so miigwech to you, miigwech for your gifts for our readers, for us tonight, for myself, and then we will take that gift on. So that we're saying miigwech, where it's a commitment to carry that forward and to do something with that knowledge, passing it into the future. So miigwech, Tanya.
Miigwech, Nigan. Miigwech.
Thank you all so much for that amazing discussion. Before we move into sort of next month book club matters, I'm going to throw it over to Leah to talk a little bit about tomorrow's event.
So hopefully you enjoyed tonight, but if you just aren't full yet, because there's so much to learn and continue learning from Tanya, tomorrow we'll be hosting our local to global fundraiser for the Institute for International Women's Rights, Manitoba. And it is our biannual fundraiser, and we host it every 2 years in support of local community work in Winnipeg. And this year we'll be holding it online via Zoom for the first time ever. And all our proceeds will be contributed to Mama Wichita Center, Artbeat Studio Inc., and the University of Winnipeg Global Citizen Scholarships. So we'll be thrilled to be joined by Tanya, as well as our MC Sheila North and musician Dawn Chartrand. And it will be hosted by, like I said, by Zoom at 6:30 tomorrow. So you can find more information on our Eventbrite by searching the event, our social media, and our website, iiwrmb.ca. So we really hope to have you tune in.
Thanks so much, Leah. And before we go, of course, we're going to talk about next month's book club pick, which is, oh, my library background. Okay, this has nothing to do with you by Lauren Carter. Lauren is originally from Ontario, but is now living in Manitoba, and we're moving back into fiction. This is a fiction novel, and she won the, oh, I wrote it down and now I can't find it, Margaret Lawrence Award for Fiction in 2020. So we're super excited to get into this novel. If you haven't noticed, we're trying to kind of waffle between fiction and nonfiction every other month. So that pattern, I can tell you, is going to keep going till the rest of the year. We just picked our November and December books as well, so we're really excited to share those with you. Thank you so much again, Tanya and Nigan. I know, especially Nigan, you've had a very busy day, so we appreciate you giving your time tonight to help with this, and to Leah for her contributions as well. And we will see you all again next month. Bye, everybody.
Everyone.
OP. See you later.